Welcome back to the King Exchange. Last time we dissected the Republican machine and the looming battle for the Florida governor's mansion between heavyweights like James Fishback and Byron Donalds. But today we're looking across the aisle at a party currently searching for its soul. The Democratic Party is facing a crisis of identity, specifically a post target crisis. For nearly a decade, the blueprint was simple opposition. But as we look toward the 2000 midterms and the 2020 presidential cycle, the resistance label is wearing thin. Without a singular antagonist to rally against, what do the Democrats actually stand for? Here in Florida, the stakes are even more dire. Once the ultimate swing state, Florida has shifted into a deep shade of red. The question isn't just about policy, it's about viability. Can a Democrat ever win the governor's mansion again? Or has the sun set on the party in the Sunshine State? Today, we define the resistance without a target. Joining me to break it all down are the minds behind this strategy. We're joined by David, founder and owner of J.N. Washington, CEO of Door to Door I4, the man who doesn't just manage campaigns, he decodes the human behavior behind them. We're joined also by Kellen, operations director. He views the intersection of law, media, and politics as a critical opportunity to reform how we govern. And last but not least, we're joined by Kevyn, social media associate, the pulse of the next generation, approaching every piece of content with the mindset of a future campaign strategist. So let's get straight into it. I would really like to focus first on the national identity of the Democrats. And focusing specifically on the upcoming midterms and moving towards 2028. There has to be a shift inevitably away from reactive politics, right? So for a decade, Trump has been in some sort of public sphere politically mainstream. So the Democrats have always built their identity around Trump, anti-Trump, even when Biden was in office. So now that Trump will be out in a few years, who is their next target? Will they actually be appealing to the American people, the needs of the American people, or will they continue to speak about Trump and demonize him in a way, even though it's, not even, it will no longer be relevant. So that's my take, and I'd like to expand on that. So starting with David, you're, an expert in decoding behavior around politics. For years, the Democratic base was driven by anti-Trumpism, as I said. Now that the political landscape is shifting, how do you mobilize a base that has forgotten how to vote for something rather than against someone?
Hey, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Kellen and Kevin. It is very good to be back on the King Exchange, Sean, because the last episode we had was a brilliant one. It was very successful. I really enjoyed the discourse. May I answer that one question that you started your commentary with? What defines the Democratic Party? And I'm going to try to stay as positive as possible in this episode in regard to the Democrats. However, right now, today, April 16th, Thursday, the year 2026, who are the Democrats? The Democrats are the representatives, Representative Eric Stilwell, Representative Sheila Surveillance McCormick, AOC, Representative Presley, Ihan Omar. That's the Democratic Party right now. So if the Democrats are going to be successful in having an identity, it can't be these folks. It really can. And this is your left wing of the party that is pretty much driving the narrative. And as you see Trump looking at his last 2.5 years as president, you're not going to see the end of Trumpism. So we're seeing that being laid out on the world stage, on the national stage. That's not going away. However, the folks who still cling on to DEI and wokeism and all that stuff, that's not going to win the presidency, governorships in red states or purple states for the Democrats. It's just not.
Yeah. And I kind of want to expand on that a little bit because I made sure to pull up the last year's Gallup poll. Now, given how reactionary the public is, I know 1 year can be a lot. But when you look at Republicans, and their thoughts on Republicans, you see that they either wanted to kind of stay, most of them seem to want to stay the same or shift more conservative, with, of course, there also being a movement to move more moderate. But they see this really kind of, staunch, stay conservative or be more conservative. Again, this was last year. Who knows if it's changed? But Democrats, you kind of see, because they poll the more left-leaning Democrats and the more moderate Democrats, where you see this really stark contrast, where over 60% of moderate Democrats, and the same thing holds true with independent voters, who are very important, especially in states like Florida. Well over 60% of them will say it wants to become more moderate. And this is, but yet, you look at the more left-leaning branch, they want to become more left-leaning. The problem that you encounter, the reason why David is saying that you can't, stick with, folks like AOC and Ilhan Omar is because they play well with Democrats. They play very good in the primaries, but they struggle in generals. And that's a problem that many candidates have had throughout the history of this country, as long as we've had political parties, where what happens in a primary and what happens in the general are very, very different. And that's kind of, I think, a lot of that tension that you have in the Democratic Party, right? You have one wing, that views their own party as just more of the same, right? That they're not meaningfully different from the Republicans and that they should be. And then you have the people outside that more immediate circle who are primarily looking for stability, right? They're not necessarily looking for a huge radical change, right? But they are, for one reason or another, upset with the Republicans' direction, and they don't know. And when you're offering an alternative to Republicans, like that's somewhat similar, but more moderate, that's an easy sell for a lot of people. But when it gets to a point of, what do I like very staunch conservatism or very staunch leftism, then it becomes a challenging pick again. And I think that's why the Democrats keep gravitating towards, we're not the same as Donald Trump. We're against that, because we have seen the public become more reactionary ever since the TV became a huge part of politics. The public has become more and more reactionary every single cycle. Maybe we've seen it since the 90s. Every single time, except for post 9/11, the incumbent party always loses the midterms. Always. They have not won without 9/11 in like 3 or 4 decades. It just doesn't happen. That's how reactionary we are, because we fixate on who's in power. So I think I see what David's point is. Like it's a tough sell when the public wants the Democrats to be more moderate, but a small group of Democrats within the party want them to be more left-leaning. There's kind of a tension there. It's very difficult.
So, Kellen, just to follow up with that, and then I'll get to Kevin just quick. So from a reform perspective, would you say that the Democratic Party needs like a complete structural overhaul to survive, for its platform to survive? Or is their blueprint simply a matter of finding a more charismatic messenger? Because that's another thing they struggle with their lack of identity, a messenger for their party.
I'll always say that I think political parties are stronger when they are not a cult of personality. I think when you look at the Democratic platform, right, you see a wide range of things on a wide range of issues. The question is what becomes at the forefront. And I'm going to use a Republican analogy real quick, right? There's all kinds of things Donald Trump stands for. Like he talks about like cryptocurrencies, but that's not something that when you ask the average Trump voter, oh, why'd you vote for him? They don't say, his cryptocurrency policy. No, because that issue was kind of on the back burner for him. They voted on him for immigration or the economy or Israel or whatever it is they voted for him on, right? You have to pick issues to be your heavy hitters in the front and those that you just kind of have in the back. Like, you believe these things, you will do these things, but you don't think many voters care for them. I think that a lot of the issues that they encounter is just that they're picking the wrong stuff to put up front. Because, David talked about, those kind of, I don't like using the word woke because it's kind of lost all meaning, but that kind of more social justice oriented movement has been shown to kind of be inconsistent, because it seems it's not necessarily that people are, like, the majority of the public is just that staunchly against it. It's more that they just don't seem to care that much at this point. Like, it just doesn't have the punch it used to have. And so a lot of times people are these days way more concerned about the value of their dollar, the security of their employment, things like that. And there are a lot of Democrats who do have meaningful messaging on issues like that, but those issues still are not making their way to the forefront. Again, it keeps getting stuck in that whole social sphere, that things aren't going socially the way they should. And that's, I think, kind of a rough, kind of a sandy foundation to build a massive nationwide electoral push on, I think.
Kevin, I would like to get your thoughts on this, and then I have another question for you.
All right, sure. So I really agree with Kellen's analysis of this situation. Like, I think that, like, I wasn't here for the Republican discussion, but I would have had a very similar take on that as well, where I feel like this midterm season is a really strange period, and especially going in 2028. Like, it's a really strange transitional period, because obviously Trump has been the focus of both parties for the last 10 years. And you have this position where he's no longer going to be relevant, and then how do you progress both movements, both the anti-Trump movement and the Trump movement, past him as a person, him as like a figure? So what I think the main issue is that, like, if you're a party in transition, you have to have a consistent message and you have to have leadership. Like, I think about, like, how the Democrats consolidated around Obama as a figure in 2008 in that season, because, like, Obama was this charismatic figure that was able to unite the disparate politics of the party around, like, one person. Like, the moderates liked him, the progressives liked him, to an extent. Like, there was a general sense of unity, kind of in the same way that Trump would do with the Republicans later on. But I just don't see that right now. I don't see one candidate that could unify the party. Like, if Gavin Newsom becomes the main front runner, there's going to be a significant portion of the party that's against that. If AOC is the front runner, same thing. A significant portion of the party is going to be against that. Like, I don't see one person. Now, if it was going to happen, it would be someone that's barely relevant right now. I think there's definitely a possibility that whoever runs for office in 2028 would be someone that we don't really have on the radar at this moment. But I think that's the core issue. It's like, the party has a great opportunity here to really speak to the American people, but are they going to? Are they going to resonate with the voters in that sense? And I would be cautious about assuming that they'll be able to seize the initiative that Trump's and the Republicans are giving them right now.
And I have another. Oh, David, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I just want to respond to both Kevin and Kellen, and walk down this road with me. I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible, and I did promise to be as positive as I can in regards to Democrats. However, Sean, to your question, I don't think Democrats need to be successful in winning. Actually, they can be successful in losing. And Democrats don't need a president. And follow me here. Democrats seem to do extremely well.
Yeah.
They're working with nonprofits, NGOs, and funding their campaigns and setting up foundations, and in general, making sure that they have their gravy train. If they're out there, they need Trump as their foil. And so the more that Trump is out there, the more that they hoot and holler and scream, Orange Man is bad. And the money keeps rolling in. They will fund the Kamala Harris campaign to a tune of $1.2 billion. They will fund the Galvin Newsom campaign. They will fund a Ilhan Omar campaign, Representative Presley. And these are folks who came to Congress, the representatives I've just mentioned, with zero or negative net worth. And if you look them up right now, they're worth $8 million, $30 million. The Democratic Party has become a racket for nonprofits, NGOs to fund individual members on the backs of these so-called issues that get people very emotional, whether it's, opposition to ICE, LGBTQ issues, Trumpism in general. Democrats are winning, and they're winning. Lately, they have been winning, and amen to that. In these special elections, they have done extremely well. However, the significance of those wins are overblown when you have a very small electorate winning these elections, these special elections that put a Democrat into a seat that they need to defend 2 months from now or 2 days from their win. The bigger picture, as Kellen was saying earlier, they need to start winning these primaries and these general elections with a message that is for America. In my opinion, their message is not for America in general or America first, to steal a phrase. Their message is for the individualism of their candidacy in certain interests, and to play as a foil to make America great again, MAGA, Trumpism, so forth and so on.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and I do have one more question for Kevin, but I see Kellen, I think you want to respond.
No, ask Kevin his question. Those thoughts will have time later.
Okay, and then we have another segment up next after this, which will focus on the future of the Democrats here in Florida. But first, Kevin, and then both Kellen and David can respond. When we're looking at the next generation, and I ask you this as a student, young voters are increasingly disillusioned with establishment labels, either identifying themselves as strictly a Democrat, strictly a Republican. They're just more anti-establishment in general and skeptical of institutions. And so does the Democrat brand still carry weight with Gen Z, or is it more like the woke faction of the party? Or is the party just losing the digital war for attention overall? Because as David was saying just moments before, with the Orange Man bad crowd, I mean, you can get young people like at the No Kings on the streets chanting whatever
Small amounts.
in small amounts. But does that really carry weight across the generation to galvanize them to be the future leaders of the party? I mean, as we see on both sides, but I see more specifically on Democrats, they're just more older. So for Democrats, how does Gen Z play in here?
That's a great question, Sean. And I was actually bringing this up, but then you asked the question, and now I can offer a response. I think there's like you said, the genuine sense of disillusionment. I think that's with both parties, but I think the Republicans as a party will be able to navigate it more because there's a core ideological message being pushed.
Mhm.
I know from experience with like what I would describe as like left-wing sympathetic people maybe they're not necessarily like full blown Democrats. They're not even necessarily like leftists. I'm not like talking about that. But people that are generally against Trump, people that are generally against some of the policies he's, carried out, which I think is a pretty large percentage of the generation. But it's not like people in my generation don't view it as, oh, okay, Trump's bad, so we trust the Democrats to act as an effective opposition. Like I feel like there's just a general sense of we know that the Democrats aren't going to do anything. And there's a hopelessness and an apathy to it. I think that a lot of again, what you call the woke stuff, the really like far left social politics stuff isn't playing as well as it might have, 2022, 2023. But I would also say that like I think social issues in general, when I say social issues, I'm talking about like the trans bathroom debates and that sort of level of issue and abortion and those sort of things. I think those have declined in relevance in general over the last few years. I don't hear people talking about them as much or building their campaigns or building their political identities off those issues. But I think as Gen Z is starting to deal with real kitchen table issues, if the Democrats are going to have any chance of winning generation, they really need to speak to that, because like we're not doing well as a generation. We're struggling. You have the mental health crisis, you have the cost of living crisis, and these are things they could speak to, but in a lot of cases, I feel like they choose not to. And I think that's the core issue.
I think that's a great point. And then Kellen and David, your responses as well. But I just want to also bring in the fact, looking at Turning Point USA, for example, they have galvanized, I keep using the word galvanized, but truly galvanized, rallied a whole generation of youth, of students. They even have sort of this like religious zealousy with them. Now, I personally have my own thoughts about Turning Point USA. I'm not endorsing them, but I find them such a compelling example of how the MAGA movement, the Republicans, whatever you want to call them now, this day and age, has really rallied the youth and inspired them to be leaders. Now, again, with the Democrat side, just because there's just so many voices out there, you know what I mean? And people flip-flopping based on elections because they had positions that were super, super woke going into it, and then they sort of backtrack. And so you have all different types of, younger people on the Democrat side or left side, just not Trump, let's just say anti-Trump, who may rally like, we need to elect Democrats no matter what. Others, as Kevin's saying, which I find more increasingly, the case to be, is that they don't trust Democrats to do the job, but they just know that Trump is bad, and whoever, is going to get what they want, whatever it may specifically be, we just need to vote them in. But there's something that is integral, I feel. And in my opinion, with the Turning Point USA, they propel their leaders in a way that this is the way. Like, for example, JD Vance is the way to continue our legacy. For the Democrats, there's no sort of like even younger, youth-centered, focused movement I see going on. So that's just something I wanted to add to what I feel going on.
Yeah, thank you for contributing that. And I have a few thoughts on both what Kevin said and what Sean said. So I'm going to start with Sean just because it was fresh in my mind. I think there's also a very big difference between young conservative voters and young, not conservative voters, because there are cultural differences between the two main sides. One of the main things about Republicans is that they are very loyal, sometimes loyal to a fault. They're a very, very loyal group, which makes them a lot easier to organize than those more Democrat voters, because a lot of times the reason that Democrat voters are the way that they are is that they really focus on their own ideology and their own sense of goodness, and that is kind of unrelated to what groups you're a part of, right? It's very, very personal with them, while Republicans are willing to fall in line and act like troops if need be, if they feel threatened enough. And that's why I think Turning Point USA is so effective, is because they do put out the message that the young conservative are threatened enough. You are threatened enough, so you need to be doing your part to.
And there's a greater calling also, Kellen. I need to put that in there because there is a greater calling in their faith, in the faith
Yes.
that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior. God has in
Right. It's almost in a sense your purpose and your destiny to be a part of this movement, right? And I don't think that's a message that works very good with the more left-leaning blocks of voters, and I think that's a lot of the difficulty. There is kind of that joke where it goes around of, conservatives always talking about, the organized Antifa, but it doesn't even really exist because leftists can't organize that way. So I think there's a reason why there's a struggle there, because it is so ideologically focused. And right now, the ideology of that block of voters is all over the place, and that makes it very challenging. And as far as, what Kevin, you were talking about leadership, you're talking about, that kind of thing. Because you're right. And I know this, I'm going to add on to what David said as well. There is an element of what comes from Democrats without Trump, right? Without the thing that they're against, because that seems to be what the kind of niche they've settled into recently. It's that you're anti this, anti that. But right now, they have all the setup they need, right? They have setup. In theory, they could really pull out a victory because of just how unpopular their opponents are. I mean, we've been seeing this as well, globally. There's been some renewed resistance in this type of policy. We just saw it in Hungary this week. Mm-hmm. However, they need to build themselves on a ground that's more sustainable, that maybe you win 2026, maybe you win 2028, but you ain't winning 2030 and 2034 if things keep going the way that they are. We'll just keep doing this forever and ever. They need to find something more sustainable to stand on. And to your point, Kevin, I think part of the reason why we focus so much on those woke issues and again, I don't like using the buzzword, but I'll use the buzzword for the purposes of the discussion, kind of that woke thing. It doesn't resonate as much, but we keep going back to it, and we keep going back to that stuff because it's easy, right? When you talk about what the Democrats, I would say, actually need to focus on, it's not something I'd say most of them intellectually have in them. Because right now, a lot of the issues we have in our country stem from the fact that our institutions and our systems are unsustainable at their core, right? There's a lot of issues of, stuff, too much. It's like the image of the snake eating itself. It's been going on for about 50 years now. The Republicans are kind of trapped in a corner because, on one hand, their funding base is heavily based on those systems. So if you threaten to take them down, you threaten to take down your own funding. That, and the fact that a lot of conservatives don't, they kind of don't want overhauls. A lot of times they idolize the past. And so when you're kind of threatening institutions that have been there since the past, you have an issue with your voters now. So the Republicans are kind of trapped in a corner. There's not that much electorally, politically, not much leverage they have. And the Democrats, in theory, do have that leverage more. However, that then brings up the question, how do you fundamentally overhaul long-standing institutions? That is a far more complicated question than, do trans people deserve rights? It's a much harder question to answer.
Which institutions, Kellen?
Primarily financial and political process. For example, I'll just pull an example, like how business people are paid. Because right now, when you pay them with stock options, which is something that started to rise kind of post-70s, it oftentimes incentivizes CEOs to search a stock and get out. And a lot of times the way they do that is to sell off assets or to fire people, or in general sabotage the long-term viability in favor of short-term. And that's something that's been happening for so long that you're seeing a lot of stuff get crappier because these companies are getting gutted, or you have private equity or Wall Street, buying up homes or buying up businesses and then gutting them, kind of asset flipping. There's a lot of asset flipping. And a lot of that kind of ends up in the government as well. That's just an example. There's a couple others, but that's, I think, one of the major ones.
Okay.
Am I making sense to you?
It makes sense, and I just have the disruption to that particular scenario or example that I'll share after you give your explanation.
Yeah, I'm almost done my whole thing. it's harder to answer those questions, like those really, because those are difficult, hard hitting. Like if you're going to get rid of these cornerstone institutions, you have to replace it with something. But what are you going to replace it with? And that's where I think a lot of times you get into those weeds. And I can tell you, I'm not going to go too in depth with this, but I've had this personal experience as well, where I've asked some Democrats in my own government, like, hey, I'm all for doing this thing, but what comes after? I feel like if we don't do X, Y, and Z after the fact, it was all for naught. And that's where they run out of answers. And so I think that's why we keep gravitating back to the social thing, because the ends are simple. The means are simple. The ideology is simple. It's an easy thing to answer. Right now, I don't think the Democrats have a cohesive answer. How do we meaningfully change these large-scale affordability and sustainability issues?
I think there are disruptions that the Trump administration has created the start. I'll take your example of the financial services system. With the introduction of cryptocurrency, stable coins, the blockchain, and tokenization of real world assets, you've got JP Morgan Chase, you've got BNY, you've got Citicorp, you've got Visa, MasterCard, you've got all these financial giants who are moving towards Bitcoin ETFs and tokenizing assets. You'll have that in real estate. You're seeing the Trump administration look at Freddie and Fannie Mac, the last guarantor of mortgages, and reworking that whole system. I think we are seeing these disruptions to these large institutions that maybe the everyday voter is not hearing about or seeing, but these things are in the work. The Clarity Act, the Genius Act, these are fundamental disruptions to the financial system as we know it. And it's just amazing from my point of view, because I'm just into it.
And I'll kind of add it, because those things are happening, and yes, those could heavily change things. I'll say, as far as like how we change institutions, if anything, it's almost like rolling the clock really, really, really far back. Because the main thing when you do with cryptocurrencies is that you remove government control of currency, right? And that's something that has played to mixed results in this country in the past. So I could see it going a wide variety of ways. And I think a lot of what you're saying, you have these fundamental disruptions. Because if you envision the society as like a pyramid, you got lower income, you go up to higher income. A lot of the issues are happening a lot of these reforms are happening near the top of the pyramid, right? A lot of these things won't affect people in the lower like 2/3 as much. At least not in any time in the near future. Like in theory they can, but a lot would have to go into that. And as far as we've also seen things like, we're going to stop companies from buying individual homes. But when you pull back the curtain on those policies, it's kind of like putting out a fire with like an eyedropper, because there's really all they did was a minor inconvenience to the fire, but they haven't actually, all they're doing is kind of just putting a Band-Aid on an issue that's gonna still keep happening, because all it did was just make it a little bit tougher. But you can still do it. They can still buy unlimited.
I just want to I think it's a great discussion, but just for the sake of the show's time, I like to transition to the second segment, and then Kevin, I'll start with you for a question, and then if you have anything to respond, of course, to what was just said. But just to introduce the next segment, because I want to focus also on Florida specifically, focusing on Orlando and Tallahassee and the future of Florida Democrats. So, Kevin, looking at the upcoming Florida governor's race, we were looking at the does the Florida Democratic Party even have a path to victory in any sense, or have they lost the corridor for good? Is there any hope?
I think right now they're pretty much done. Like I obviously I don't think there's no party that's going to be in power for 80 years. That's not how America works. That's how states work. But like I think for the most part, the chances of a Democrat winning the Florida election in 2024 6, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it is basically none. I did some cursory research on like the hopefuls, and the only real like legitimate candidate that I saw when that was being promoted was I forget his first name, but his last name is Jolly, and it's basically a Chris Christie situation with less name recognition. Like they're trying to tap a former Republican. That's not going to work. It didn't work last time. It's not going to work this time. But they're doing it because they have literally no one.
David Jolly.
Do you mean Charlie
David
Chris?
Jolly.
Yeah.
Wait, when you said Chris Christie, do you mean
Yeah.
Charlie Chris?
Oh yeah, yeah.
These
That's
names
very
are very
funny.
similar. I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
That's a very funny mental image that just popped in my mind. But yeah, you're correct. You're correct. It'd be Charlie Chris. But it's the same playbook. It was a bad playbook when they did it. It's still a bad playbook, and it's just like, I would look at that and say, like, what are they doing? Like, I don't even think that I think this is going to be a pretty low turnout election, to be honest. I don't think I think DeSantis was unique in Florida politics. He was kind of like our mini Trump for the years that he was relevant. In the sense that like people liked him, people moved to Florida specifically because he was governor. People liked his policies, and he was also very like when I mentioned how years ago a lot of that really hard right social issue stuff was playing well. That played well. That was really the DeSantis era. That was Moms for Liberty. That was that whole era of politics that he kind of like started and then exemplified in like 2022 to like 2024. But I think, I mean, I haven't actually seen the full video you discussed with Donald's, but I think it's pretty clear to say that he's going to be the next governor of Florida.
Yeah.
Kellen, and to that, but focusing more on the local side of things, if there was a local success in a city like Orlando, how would that translate to a statewide win for the rest of Florida when the map is turning bright red? And I think we can look to, Miami for an example, where they, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they had a Republican mayor and now they elected a Democrat mayor in the recent so if that was correct, they were going back and forth. And so there's the success in a city like Miami or Orlando for the Democrats. Will that eventually turn to a statewide win for the party?
I don't think so. Like, at least not on its own, because what plays well in a local government, what plays well in the state government are oftentimes different things, right? Like, let's take Orange County here, for example, since Jerry Demings is running. Jerry Demings is the mayor of Orange County. Our electorate here, compared to the electorate in, let's say, like everywhere in like the Panhandle, are very different. Florida is sometimes there's benefits, sometimes there's detriment, a very diverse state. You kind of have this gradient that runs north to south, where there's like this dramatic demographic shift of voters with very different issues. Like the top issues in North Florida compared to South Florida are very different. And we have seen in like the greater Miami metro, a lot of that kind of fluctuation, because it's an electorate that has shown to be fairly divided, but also fairly reactionary. So I don't think anything. I think any win there for either party is honestly kind of temporary. I wouldn't expect a very stable political state to last there for any particularly long amount of time. I think what the Democrats would need to do on the state level, their playbook now is kind of a case of things aren't being run good. So we need somebody new, is what I kind of get, right? We need somebody different who isn't one of these, hardliner conservatives. The problem with that is we've had this huge influx of people who, come here, they register to vote here because they're under the impression that Florida is running very, very well. So it's kind of a message that has a lot of dissonance to a lot of people. What do you mean our state is doing bad? It looks pretty fine to me. I love it here. What they would need to offer, and again, this kind of goes back to the issues we're talking about the national Democrats, is they need to offer something positive, right? They need to be able to put something some new plan, like that's meaningfully different, but still one that is appealing enough so that many voters would be willing to give them a chance. And I just don't think they've had that. Again, they've fallen too much into the issue of, we're going to focus on social issues and we're going to focus on how bad of a job the Republicans are doing. But particularly that second wing hasn't really been resonating enough to even come close at sniffing out a gubernatorial victory.
David, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't see David Jolly or Jerry Demings succeeding in November. I believe that the special legislative session that is slated for the end of this month into May, it will weigh heavily with voters. You have the budget that will be discussed, a possible property tax relief amendment that will show up on the November ballot that will be discussed. And you also have the congressional district redistricting discussed. And so at the end of this month, those decisions will play into this gubernatorial race. I don't see the Democratic gubernatorial candidates discussing something very local that's happening right now. There's a great deal of opposition among liberals and Democrats in regards to Senate Bill 180, which was pretty much a relief for homeowners and businesses after natural disasters. It's been interpreted by the legislature as more broad, which gives the state greater control over land use issues locally. And so there's a lawsuit that's pending in court right now. There's only one defendant who has been directly affected. Her name is Hildebrand. I forget her first name, Sheila Hildebrand or something like that. However, as we see more and more preemption by the state over local issues, voters need to understand that the importance of who they elect as their state reps, their state senators, and the governor is going to be very important. And when people want things to be safe, they want to be able to use their property legally in ways that may benefit them and their families, they're going to look at what the Republicans are doing and saying, okay, I'm going to go that route instead of delving into these, niche issues like the environment and, things like that.
Right. Are you saying in a sense they could tie them together just under the, local government umbrella, local government staying local and the state government staying out of it?
Well, what I'm saying is that locally, especially in democratically held localities like Orange County, they want to prevent and disallow certain use of your property, of your private property. People aren't going to go for that. That's why going back to Governor DeSantis defeating Andrew Gillum, it was pro-choice. I'm not pro-choice, pro-parent choice. It was parental choice and determining the educational outcomes of their children that really kept, moved them past the finish line ahead of Gillum. So going back to this individual choice, individual liberty to do what you believe is best for yourself and your family, I think this is going to be the same issue that plays out in November and August during the primaries, and we'll get the similar results. Republicans continue to hold the state legislature and the governor's mansion.
Those are great points. I do want to bring up just some recent news that hits home locally, at least for UCF. and sort of ties into my discussion here. And then I have one more question and final thoughts, and that will be it. Okay. So last Friday, Caitlin Bennett, who I continue to
Right.
up, but I just find her relevant because she is a very prominent media figure, online personality who is local to Central Florida. She was at UCF and she spoke with students of the UCF Sunrise government.
Oh yes, yes,
Sunrise UCF. And
yes.
the student organization hosted a walkout on Memory Mall protesting ICE cooperation on campus. And some way they were just able to also get in there demanding raises for professors. So I don't know how the two correlate, but again, we're talking about messaging for Democrats, and I mean that's it right there. So um, they were providing attendees, the option to sign a petition in favor of these causes to be sent in a letter to President Alexander Cartwright. Along with the petition, a memorial was put in place for people who have been killed by ICE agents. The walkout also offered students free pizza, drinks, and free to all clothing drive. So they just got everything in there. Other organizations were in attendance at the protests, notably UCF's chapter of Turning Points, and the Sunrise UCF president spoke about working with Campus Climate, Youth in Action Fund, also working with the NAACP, and so many different organizations for the planning and for the logistics of this. And the goal was notably to include removing UCF from the 287G program, which allows ICE to work with states and local law enforcement and making UCF a safe haven campus. Definitions of what safe haven means vary by state, yet most don't allow federal ICE agents on campus without a warrant or court order, protecting the undocumented students from being detained on campus. So again, they have their whole list of demands. I don't know how, just like the No Kings, I don't know how this really solves anything much, other than just basically making a fool of themselves, because when confronted with just simple questions like we're doing here, they get angry, they get combative, and as a journalist, Caitlin Bennett simply just coming to ask questions, and then just because they know her, they get so riled up. And we're talking about the Democrats here. Outside of UCF, the organizations, Youth in Action, the Young Democratic Socialist of America, Socialist Alternative, were all in attendance at this walkout. So we have the socialists, self-labeled socialists,
Yeah.
in attendance with the whole ICE thing. And we also need to give our professors raises. I mean, it's ludicrous to me. And the fact that their whole thing is to make UCF basically a sanctuary campus is, again, bonkers. I mean, and I'll wrap this up, but just my thoughts here. When I was at UCF, I honestly, like, honest to God, and I'm from New York City, right? Like, I'm used to diversity. When I came to UCF, it was actually the most diverse place that I've ever been in. Like, I heard languages spoken that I've never heard. And I'm not saying anything either way about that. I'm just simply making an observation that UCF is a very diverse campus. And the fact that they want to just basically add to that and basically be like, if you're undocumented, you have all protection here. We need to focus on the American students at UCF who are paying tuition. So their whole point here, their whole agenda just goes on and on and on. And when you tie in free this and sanctuary this and our professors need a raise, it's like, again, what is the messaging when you're basically teaming up with socialists?
I think there's a lot of things to reasonably complain about with some of the recent decisions made by the board at UCF, just specifically with they did some. I've mentioned this to David many times because it bugs me. They gave a 50% raise to the president and cut out bus lines in order to cover it. So there are some managerial things, but I think they're misguided, not necessarily in what they want, but the institution that they're trying to turn into that thing. right? Like, and this was another discussion I had because there were some students upset about, I think it was the presence of Northrop Grumman, I think, with their recruiting and like when they were trying to recruit some engineering students to serve as interns, and there was this kind of movement of like, let's protest this. On the other hand, you have multiple huge sections of campus paid for by Lockheed Martin, paid for by L3 Harris, like one of the main engineering buildings. Like I took a class there. L3 Harris is it's literally just what the building is called. And furthermore, it's a state institution. What happens at this, what the state of Florida ultimately wants to happen will happen. It just depends on how much they care to make it happen. So it's not the right place to try to build that kind of atmosphere because there's only so much you can do. The wallet, which at the end of the day with institutions like this, it's very important, is backed by a lot of these things that these students are against. And they're ultimately controlled by the very same powers that these students are opposing. You just can't get anywhere by protesting the university directly because they're beholden to so many other people who have way more pull than any individual student does. The only way I could see this realistically changing, I think, were to be if these issues seriously impacted the financial status of the school somehow, which I'm not sure what that looks like. I just don't know.
I
observations.
The point of me, and I understand what you're saying. The point of me more bringing this story up was just highlight the fact with the discussion of the Democrats in Florida, their messaging. It's like they can't focus on one singular thing. How does I get it? Let's tie everything in, right? We like let's rally the social, let's rally NAACP, and just get everybody out there buy free pizza and just be like, you need to basically say no ice and give our teachers a raise to basically teach, I don't know what, gender theory. I was in a class for sociology and I had a professor, she was in her 60s, and first day introductions, I go by she, he, they pronouns, all of them. And when addressing her, because she went by her as well, she said, I do identify as a her, but I would really appreciate if you also integrate the he and the they in my address. And I'm like, first of all, when does any student address the professor by he or she? But my point there being, I don't really think that she deserves a raise. I'm sorry. So that's crap. That's bull in itself. And so how does that even tie in to something that they're talking about? We have pictures of everyone killed by ICE, right? It does, the messaging is just, there's no singular focus. And how do you want to progress the Democrat Party in Florida when you have such craziness going on?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. And I think David brought up an interesting point when we were talking about land use earlier. There are ways to bundle several meaningful issues together, but you have to find a way that does it elegantly. You're right. Just coming out and doing multiple things at once is doing multiple things at once. It's doing too much. And I want to add on to your comments about professors. In the big 2023, I had a professor who told us that he actually knew who was in the Epstein files. He gave us their names too. Turns out some of them were right, some of them were really not. It was, there are, like with many institutions, definitely if you're a student there, definitely fill out and have your voice heard about the quality of your professors, because there is a lot of variance at UCF. In my experience, there was a lot of variance. Within my major, it was good. Within my upper level minor, it was good. Within gen ed, it was all over the place. But no, I see what you're saying, though, that some focus would be good, right? What specifically are we protesting against? Are we protesting against, the inappropriate use of budget? Are we protesting against the involvement of, law enforcement? Are we protesting, what exactly, like which issue are we protesting? It's easy to have a cohesive to drive people, and it's good to have relevance if you organize a thing with focus in mind instead of treating it almost a little bit socially, right? This is the place of people who believe in good things, whatever.
Kevin,
right.
Hit it,
yeah,
Kevin.
I have to go pretty soon, but I would like to address the thing I'm going to focus on, because there's a lot to address with that. But the main thing that I want to bring up, my own personal experience, is when I got to UCF, year and a half ago. Yeah, about a year and a half ago. I originally did get involved in some of the social organizations you're talking about. Like I tried to be part of UCFDEMs, and I did a couple of volunteer things. And I want to bring it back. I want to bring it full circle back to what David said originally about the NGOs. And like how it's kind of like a racket for the NGOs, and that's what I picked up on. That's why I stopped getting really involved, like on campus political organizations, because a lot of those organizations that you mentioned, it was very clear to me that they were basically just like for careerists. They didn't really care about the issues. They didn't really have a vision of how to make things better. They were just fundamentally like, political science majors and like, nonprofit management majors that wanted to farm their resume. And there was a lot of money going into it and a lot of money going out of it. And it definitely disillusioned me with a lot of the process of like youth politics. And I'm sure the Republican organizations aren't any better, but I feel like at least they have like the coherent ideological statement. While I think with the campus political organizations that are more on the left, there's so many of them and they're so like disparate and unorganized that there really isn't a viable strategy. Like they can protest, but I mean, I wasn't on campus, but I doubt it was like a huge deal. I'm sure the average person, average UCF student walked by, had their AirPods in, didn't pay any attention, and went to class.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents on that.
I think that's a great point, and I think you actually highlighted something that really brings this together with the Democrats. They're careerist, right? And again, not to say, as you said, it's any different with the Republicans. Of course, everyone's an opportunist and they're always looking to get the way up in politics. That is basically the game of politics. But there's no messaging, and there's just so many different types of groups that it's like, what can you bring people together? What is the Turning Point USA, right? Turning Point USA is like this revival, this like almost religious movement, and there's nothing. And again, they had their martyr Charlie Kirk, and we are all Charlie Kirk, and like that whole thing, right? But not to say that someone has to die or be killed on the left for that to happen, but like what can happen? Who can bring that together to bring to give us a singular message? And that brings me to my last question, which I'll turn to David first. If you were building a coalition for a Democratic gubernatorial candidate today, what is one unignorable message you would push to counter the current Republican momentum?
Well, the first thing I would say to a potential, Democratic gubernatorial candidate and their supporters would be, there are some good ideas on the other side that used to be good ideas by the Democrats not too long ago. Mm-hmm. Get back to your roots. However, at the same time, I'll be more realistic and understand that there are certain entities, certain nonprofits and NGOs, certain special interests that want Democratic candidates to toe the line. And if they don't, they won't get support. They will not get the support needed to have boots on the ground, to drum up that support among voters, to galvanize voters, to persuade voters. They'll be ignored. And I've been there with other candidates, not at the gubernatorial level, but in other candidates. If you don't toe the Democratic line, you're ignored. You're put off to the side. And then they're surprised when you win and they come to you and say, hey, be on our side. Hey, vote for this. Hey, support that. Hey, come march with us. And they're shocked when that particular candidate who becomes elected says, no, I'm going to stay authentically me. That got me into this position, my authentic self. And there are Democrats who have walked away I'm part of that group who walked away from the local Democratic Party here in the state of Florida, the Florida Democrats, and said, you know something, I'm not going to subscribe to the ideology, to the brazen theft of the average American's pocketbook, their tax dollars to benefit themselves, using nonprofits to enrich themselves. I'm not going to do that. I would tell the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, their supporters, if you're really going to run as your authentic self, which may mean not having the support of most Democrats.
And for Kevin, I know you have to go soon. So any final thoughts on that? What would your message be to Democrats running?
I actually did a hypothetical project last semester about this particular question, like trying to chart a future for the Democratic Party in Florida. And my general was like focus on the kitchen table issues. Like, especially in Florida, you're not going to win with the DEI stuff. And not that that's like a huge deal anymore, but like, it's just not a winning strategy. Like, I think if there's any if there's any issue where the Democrats could really do well in Florida, it would be around a lot of the urbanization and like public transportation issues, especially here in like Central Florida and especially in like Miami. You know, cities that are struggling with a lot of like urban planning and just general development issues. I think there's an avenue there to convince people of like to give people something to vote for rather than against.
Yeah.
I think that's very smart, actually. I think that's something I could see the Democrats, not that I probably would agree with any of their proposals to fix those problems, but I think if at least their messaging, if they focus on like urbanization and transportation, which has traditionally been their sort of like, points and issues that they care about, I think they could really be successful there. And then, Kellen, any final thoughts, messaging you have for the Democrats?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if you want to stay, purely in your social circle and focus on the personalities of the individual people, the morality of your individual candidates, you're going to continue to be where you are, right? Which is that you're a super minority party who protests. If you want to do something meaningful, you have to give something positive into the system rather than just hacking at its ankles. You have to actually be able to appeal to the general, not just the primary. What any individual, one small group of people thinks is almost never what the general population thinks. And we hear this all, David and I, we've experienced this on the campaign trail before, right? Where a lot of the inner circle of Democrats will want to push a more intense message because not just because they're trying to use their connection to a candidate to get their thoughts out, but because they genuinely do at their core think that that is what the public is, that they actually do, that they are representing the public every time they do something like that. It's important to acknowledge who you are rather than who you wish you are. And if what you are is unusual from the public, then you need to play around that. You need to know who you are at your core. And you can't just blame your outcomes on the people around, right? The people around is who you represent. If you don't really represent them, no wonder you lose.
Awesome. Okay, so before we sign off, I want to invite our listeners to join the conversation and find your place in the strategy. Visit the T8020 community at j-washington.com/T8020 to get involved. And finally, on a personal note, we want to dedicate this episode to Claude Smith. Without his vision and support, none of this would be possible. The exchange T8020 community, we owe him a debt of gratitude for the foundation he built. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and making the time. I think we had a great discussion. This was an amazing part two to our first episode discussing the Republicans and bringing it all together with the Democrats. I think everybody raised really important issues here and things that the Democrats really should consider. I think the Democrats, if they want to be successful, should hire each and every one of you to run their campaigns, because whoever running them right now is not doing a good job. I think Kevin brought up a really excellent point that I think we can touch upon in the future with the urbanization and transportation issues. I think there's a lot to there. I think there's a story there and more to look into. So again, I just want to thank you all. David, Kellen, and Kevin, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.